Today is very exciting because we're going to begin making a still life painting. And the goal for this painting is learning how to paint three-dimensional forms. This is a great foundation painting because it will help make the rest of the landscapes and other things that we will be painting for the rest of the quarter look more realistic and more three-dimensional. Before you begin painting, you have to understand the thing that creates a form and helps it look three-dimensional, and that is values. Values refer to the lightness or darkness of a color, and a good range of values makes for a realistic representation of light in 3D form. So you need to have that full range of values for that object to look three-dimensional. So here we have this awesome watercolor painting of an astronaut. You'll notice that on the right-hand side of his arm, well actually the whole right arm, is looking very three-dimensional. In contrast, the arm on the left does not look as three-dimensional as the one on the right, and that's because it has a limited range of values. The arm on the right, we're seeing the lightest whites right here, and then we're seeing that range of value go all the way down to the black, especially on that little finger. Because we have that full range of values, it allows that astronaut and his left arm to look way more three-dimensional. Same thing here with this painting of this girl. We have the brightest lights on the right-hand side of her face. The left-hand side is kind of in like a mid-value area, but then we have these darker values on the bottom as well as on her hair. Because we're seeing, once again, that full range of values, it makes for a very realistic looking painting. So how do you know what you should include with these values to make sure your object is looking three-dimensional? Well, the first one is you need to have a highlight. Your highlight is the area that's closest to the light source. And this area receives the most amount of light, so it's going to be the lightest in value. Whenever we're doing watercolor paintings, normally our highlights are the whites of the paper. We don't want to put any color down in the areas where it's supposed to be white. And that's something that you have to plan for and know in advance that, hey, I can't put any color here because that needs to be my highlight. The second value that you need to include in all of the objects that you want to be three-dimensional in your drawings is your core shadow. The core shadow is the darkest part of an object that receives little to no light. So this is essentially the area that is farthest from the light source. The third area you need to have in your watercolor paintings to help everything in the painting look three-dimensional is cast shadows. Shadows are cast from the object, and they're always on the side that's furthest away from the light source. Notice in the cast shadow here that it's darkest near the object and it gets lighter as it gets further away. That's something that is very common with cast shadows, and you will want to pay attention to that whenever you're creating your different paintings. The last value section that you should have in your forms to help them look three-dimensional is to show reflected light. Reflected light is this little lighter value section down here, and that is light that's being reflected off of the table. Oh, let me get rid of all these marks. So reflected light is light that's being bounced off the table back onto the object itself. Reflected light is very important to have because it separates the object from the cast shadow on the bottom. If you don't have that separation of reflected light, sometimes that object can kind of like melt into the cast shadow and it just ends up looking like a hot mess. To practice painting these four things in, we're going to be making our own still life that uses white objects so we can really understand and learn how to look for the highlights, core shadows, cast shadows, and reflected light. So whenever we begin doing our more complicated paintings, we have a better idea of how to train our eye to look for those four different components. We're going to be creating this still life with a movement of grays. For every gray that you see in this painting, we're going to be using a different combination of colors. It is important to experiment with mixing as many grays as you can. They are a vital aspect of color theory, all too often overlooked by students who, like most of us, are tantalized by more pure, intense hues. So by working with grays first will make it easier for you to perceive changes in value later on. Grays tend to be these transitional colors in paintings. our eye tends to look at grays a little bit slower than when we perceive and look at more intense colors. So because these grays are going to be so important to us and the type of movement we create within our paintings, our goal is to increase our gray color mixing vocabulary by really learning about how to mix the myriad of grays that you will be seeing in these later watercolor reference photos that will be used for these paintings. So to mix these grays, we're actually going to be mixing them with primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, and then combining complementary colors like red and green, blue and orange, yellow and purple to produce various grays. So because we're using color to make grays and not black and white, our grays are going to be a color and they can be perceived as being warm, cool, bluish, greenish, or reddish. You'll notice in this still life painting, there are some like more warmer grays, some cooler grays, some more like purpley grays in there as well. So with every layer of gray that we're adding on, we're going to be mixing those grays with different colors from our watercolor palette. And that's just for you to understand the myriad of grays we can make, and you'll be able to use them for paintings later on in the quarter. To begin our still life painting, you're going to need one of your painting papers, a sheet of tracing paper, and then find the black and white still life painting. And then you're going to take your still life paper, put it over top of the still life image. I always recommend tracing around the rectangle first so you know kind of what you're painting inside. These are going to be little tiny watercolor paintings, which can be challenging but also a lot easier because the areas tend to paint faster. And then trace over top of the edge of every single one of your objects with your 4H pencil. After you've traced over all of your objects, before lifting the tracing paper off, keep your fingers holding the tracing paper down and just double check and make sure you've traced everything. I've actually forgotten to trace the line for the background, so it's always good to double check before you move it off, because sometimes it can be hard to place it back on the exact right spot. So now that I have that traced, I'm going to flip this over so you guys can actually see what I'm going to do a little bit easier. I'm going to flip my tracing paper over again, and I'm going to trace directly over top of my lines on the backhand side. Do not do this over top of your watercolor paper because we don't want to trace in an inverted image of our still life. After you've traced over the back of your tracing paper, flip it over again. And this time, I want you to lay it directly on top of one of your painting papers. If you can use your paper clip, and that can hold everything in place, kind of have your painting floating in the middle of the paper. And then very gently trace over your lines again. And what this is going to do, it's going to transfer the graphite from the other side directly onto the paper. You want to make sure that you've done this with the 4H pencil, because if you use an HB pencil, the graphite can then mix with the watercolor and it can make a kind of a muddy looking color. Now for this painting, it's not that big of a deal because we're mixing grays, so we're already mixing muddy colors as it is. But whenever we get into our other paintings, we always want to do this step with our 4H pencil. And once again, before you move this off the paper, lift it up and double check that everything has gotten traced on. If not, then go back and modify those areas so you can see everything. You might not be able to see everything that I've traced because the 4H pencil makes such a light mark that it is very challenging to see probably with the video. Don't forget to trace around your edges, so if you didn't do that, make sure you've done that as well. And then there we have it. I have traced on my still life and I'm ready to begin painting. After your tracing is done, remove your mandala painting from the board, making sure you're pulling the masking tape away from the painting. Do it slowly so you don't tear any of the painting away. Next, tape the watercolor paper that has the still life drawing on it onto that board. Make sure that the paper is nice and flat and you have masking tape that covers every single edge of the paper. The only thing you're going to be painting today is going to be the background of our still life painting. To do this, we're going to be mixing black and painting it in as a flat wash on dry. Prepare your pigment for your flat wash by pulling up the black from the little circle palette, putting it in the lid of your roof, and only adding a touch of water to thin it out to make it nice and fluid. To create a flat wash, hold the board at a 30-degree angle. Load the brush with pigment and then swipe it from the left to the right. If you run out of paint, swipe again on that same stroke. After going from the left to the right, you're then going to paint from the right to the left to create that nice flat wash. After every 2 strokes, you should reload the brush to make sure that the consistency of the value of this wash is going to stay the same. You don't want to you do more than 2 strokes because then you're going to be thinning out the pigment and it's not going to be looking nice and solid. Once you get to the vase, you want to alternate the sides that you're painting on. So after you do 2 swipes on the left side, do 2 swipes on the right side. And then you want to very quickly go back to the left side. What you don't want to have happen is that watercolor to dry, because then you're going to be getting a nice solid line, which is not going to be nice at all. We want to make sure that we're creating this flat wash while the paint on either side of this painting is still wet. So this is one of those times where you have to move swiftly. You have to make sure that you're not pausing or doing something else. Once you begin painting in this background, you have to continue painting all the way down. And once again, notice I'm only doing 2 swipes per side, and then I'm going right back to the other side because I do not want this watercolor to dry and to create that harsh line. Be careful to paint around the objects. You do not want this black background color going into an area where it should not be, because you can't really erase watercolor. So plan it out, paint deliberately and slowly, and then when you're done, clean off the brush with soap and water and reform the bristles nice and flat.